Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We will just wait 1 minute as everyone moves in from the waiting room, and then we will get started. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, where we're hosting a Q&A session on understanding the Disability Discrimination Act, the guidelines on equal access to digital goods and services. My name is Sarah Police. I am one of the co-founders and director at Intopia, and I'm delighted to be your host for this session. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we are meeting today. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. If you know the country you are on, I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on its history and the deep cultural connection First Nations people have with this land. So a bit over a month ago, the Australian Human Rights Commission launched the Guidelines on Equal Access to Digital Goods and Services. The guidelines provide updated guidance on how to deliver technology that is inclusive and accessible to the 21.5% of Australians with a disability, and also meet the requirements of the Disability Discrimination Act. Hopefully, you've all had a chance to read through the guidelines and bring your curly questions to us today, or maybe the easy ones. We'd like a few of those too. We did want to announce that there is an HTML version of the guidelines available, which is in addition to the Word and PDF versions that were uploaded earlier in the month. The Commission thanks everyone for their patience in this matter. It is my delight to introduce our panelists today. First of all, we have Sophia Rinaldis, who is Director of Disability Rights at the Australian Human Rights Commission. We also have Neil Jarvis, who you would have seen online if you tuned into the launch. Neil is our Strategy and Policy Lead at Intopia. He is joined today by Andrew Arch, our Principal Accessibility Specialist at Intopia. Both Andrew and Neil supported the Commission to produce these guidelines. So we've already had a significant number of questions submitted as you registered. We are also going to be taking written questions via the Q&A feature in Zoom, and also taking verbal questions as well if you prefer. So if you do want to submit a written question, you can select the Q&A button on your Zoom webinar controls and enter your question. If you do wish to ask a question verbally, you can raise your hand through the reactions button on your Zoom webinar controls. That will notify me that you actually want to ask a question verbally, and I will give you the ability to turn on your audio and then to ask the question. So I will call on you by name. Considering how many questions we've already had through registration, we are aware that we might not get to everyone's question. For those that did submit a question that may have been related to the Disability Discrimination Act more generally, rather than about the guidelines or the digital accessibility, we would encourage you to contact the Commission directly in relation to questions such as these. We're going to be selecting questions that we feel are of interest to the broadest audience possible, and we'll also follow up with any written answers to those questions that we don't get to. We'd like to thank AI Media, who is providing the live captioning today, and also to our Auslan interpreters, Sue and Rebecca from Deaf Connect. We will have a recording of this webinar available on our YouTube channel after the webinar. Now, I'd like to very briefly turn over to Neil, who's just going to give us a very short overview of the guidelines, and then we'll get directly into Q&A. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, everybody, as it is for me, and good morning to the rest of you. So we just wanted to take 5 minutes, and it will just be that, to give you a brief reminder of where we are, how we got here, and also set the scene for the questions that may come up. So we wanted to tell you that the Commission, the Human Rights Commission, has actually been providing guidance on digital accessibility for quite some time. We think that the late 1990s was the first one that we were able to find, which was guidance on how to meet web accessibility with respect to the Disability Discrimination Act. Those guidelines were updated several times over the next few years. Most recently in 2014. The key requirement for the new guidelines was to expand the advice to go way beyond the accessibility of websites. They needed to cover all aspects of technology because, let's face it, most technology nowadays isn't just about websites. It includes mobile devices, point of sale, kiosks and payment machines, and it includes social media platforms and a lot more. So the guidelines needed to be brought up to date to reflect that. We took into account what still applied from the 2014 edition, and we worked out how to incorporate that into the new guidelines. We built on the work done by the team led by our friend and colleague Greg Alchin in 2022, which started this process of updating the guidelines. And then we looked at current trends and things that might be coming down the line with respect to accessibility and technology. Lastly, we drew on recommendations that were in the Human Rights Commission's 2021 report that was published around human rights and technology. We felt that any new guidelines needed to reflect the thinking in those recommendations. So what do the guidelines actually cover? Well, they are divided into 3 chapters. The first gives an overview of who and what digital products and services are covered by the Disability Discrimination Act, and how the Disability Discrimination Act fits into the regulatory context of disability in Australia. There's advice on good practice and keeping up with the law. Topics in this chapter include an overview of the law, what it covers and who it applies to, what is meant by digital goods and services, advice on meeting requirements of the law and delivering equal access, good practice, including universal design, and some thoughts on the fast-changing technology implications for people with disability. The second chapter of the guidelines goes into more detail about those techniques for achieving equal access when providing digital goods and services. Topics in this chapter include a discussion about the business benefits of accessibility, implementing a strategic approach to providing equal access, the importance of seeking expert advice, and incorporating digital accessibility into the product development cycle, as well as the procurement process. Digital accessibility and risk management is the last major topic in this chapter. The third chapter and the final one provides a handy reference for the various standards and guidelines which underpin this edition of the guidelines. Topics in this chapter include the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, as well as authoring tools and plain language guidelines that are available. Standards covering products and services and the design of those, including hardware, software, content management, and others. Australian government standards and policies, both at Commonwealth and at state level. And there's industry standards produced by the private sector for business groups to help them produce goods and services in an equal way. The guidelines will benefit you and everyone on this call and everyone working in Australia by enabling you to convert the fact that you know you need to meet the requirements of the Disability Discrimination Act into knowing how to do it. It's one thing to know what to do, the next thing is to know how to do it. It will help you to understand real world means by which you can keep your legal obligations meet them at the same time, as well as doing the right thing by people with disability. They explain and give links to more detailed information about the techniques and practices, standards, and other guidelines that we refer to. These guidelines are not designed to give you all the answers. They're designed to enable you to know how to find out what those answers are. So thanks, Sarah. I'll hand back to you. But that covers the main aspects of what the guidelines are for.
You're muted, Sarah.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Forgot the mute button. Where's the bingo card you can tick off, you know, host forgot mute button. Let me try that again. Thank you very much, Neil. Sophia, I wanted to start with you. We had a few questions that kind of touched on that relationship between the guidelines and also the Disability Discrimination Act and how they work in partnership. Would you be able to explain sort of what that relationship is between the guidelines and the Act, but also how are people held accountable to, I guess, anti-discrimination?
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining today. So the guidelines, and Neil kind of went over this in his presentation and overview, they provide guidance on best practice or good practice in the area of digital accessibility. So the Disability Discrimination Act sets the broad legal standard of non-discrimination on the basis of disability in all areas of public life. So public life covers education, employment, accessing goods and services, accessing public buildings, etc. And the guidelines kind of deep dive into the provision of digital goods and services and outlines non-legally binding. I think that's probably the key, one of the key points to be made here. So non-legally binding guidance as to how duty holders under the Disability Discrimination Act can enable equal access to digital goods and services. So it's translating what that broad legal standard of equal access, non-discrimination looks like in practice. So sets out practice standards like universal design, for example, that could assist in achieving the objectives of the Act. So we'll just repeat that they're non-legally binding, but in following the guidelines and in using them, like Neil said, to find the answers as to what good practice looks like, that should assist in providing equal access to digital goods and services. To your question, Sarah, around enforceability mechanisms, I guess our position is that the Disability Discrimination Act is quite lacking in that area. There is a complaints process through the Australian Human Rights Commission. So if a person has experienced alleged discrimination on the basis of disability, they can lodge a complaint with the Commission, but we've made many calls for reform, for stronger enforcement and compliance mechanisms to be introduced into the Act, and I'm sure we'll get some questions about that later on, so we can talk about that in more detail.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sophia. For anyone who's just joined, I'm just going to recap where you can ask questions. So first of all, we have questions that were submitted through the registration form, but you can also submit questions through the Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom toolbar. Or if you prefer to ask your question verbally, please raise your hand and I will call on you to ask your question verbally. So we're going to start off with a question, this question was, what challenges do you anticipate with implementation? Sophia, I might start with you on that one. What are the new challenges or challenges that you anticipate organisations may have with implementing or maybe improving the accessibility of their digital products and services?
Thanks, Sarah. I think that's a really good question. And you know, one of the reasons that the Commission partnered with Intopia on the development of these guidelines is there are aspects to digital accessibility that are very technical and that require technical subject matter expertise and technical capabilities. And that's not something that all duty holders or organizations will necessarily have in-house. And so that's the gap really that the guidelines are trying to fill, to kind of upskill organizations on how they could provide digital accessibility. So that's definitely one of the challenges that we know organizations face. And then of course, like anything, the resourcing required. And again, I think that the guidelines do a good job of outlining how accessibility can be achieved by minimizing, you know, human resourcing and financial resourcing required. So I think those are the two main challenges, and hopefully the guidelines help to address some of those.
Fantastic. Andrew, Neil, what would your thoughts around the greatest challenges people might face?
Make your mistake, Sarah, and I've unmuted now. I think one of the challenges is that lots of people tend to leave consideration of accessibility until afterwards, when they're reminded that they were supposed to do it. And it's a requirement in so many situations now. And as Neil said, in such a broad range of digital across the board. By thinking about it much earlier and getting that mindset of thinking about it right at the start of a project when you're actually creating the concept for a project, I think that's one of the challenges that organisations face, rather than treating it as a technical problem at the end of the process. So changing that mindset is a challenge for a lot of people.
And I think also one of the biggest challenges that we always hear about is, where do I go to find out what I need to do? I mean, what I need to do is always a bit of a interesting question, but where do I go to find out more, essentially, is what they're asking. And the guidelines, as we said earlier, they give a really good general explanation of what their responsibilities are as duty holders. But if you need to get into the weeds of the technology, which eventually some will, then the guidelines give you easily locatable links to go and find that extra information. So I think that's a challenge that they excuse me, that the guidelines try to address. The other one is just keeping up. Standards around technology generally, and certainly around accessibility, are changing. They're always changing because the technology is changing and the capability of the technology is changing. So knowing that you're keeping up to date with those standards is also a challenge. And again, I think the guidelines help by giving you a heads up of where you can go to make sure that you are up to date with the local latest standards and indeed local and national policy, so that you know where you are. So I think that's probably, for me, one of the biggest challenges that we hear about generally is how do I know that I'm still up to date?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Our next question is specifically to do with security versus accessibility, let's call it. The question or comment was, how do you know when to push back versus accept an answer that the software doesn't work well in this department compared to other departments because it isn't compatible with our security settings? Sorry.
Do you want to go first, Neil, on that?
Oh, okay, right. So I think that is another issue that we hear a lot in the work that Andrew and I do. We meet this regularly, where people say that they've had pushback from their cybersecurity teams. They've had pushback from others as well. But we would always say that accessibility is one of those things that no one's denying the importance of cybersecurity. I think we've seen enough examples in recent times as to why that's important. And no one denies the importance of other key aspects of data management, like data integrity, but also like things like privacy and things like that. They're all important. But hey, so is accessibility. So is the ability for people to actually use the thing that you want them to use. So we argue that accessibility should be considered at the same level as cybersecurity, privacy, and all the others. Now, I know that's going to cause a bit of a discussion and a debate within organizations, but until people start taking accessibility seriously, they're always going to find a reason why it has to take second place. So, and the last thing I would say is that if something is inaccessible, it's going to be insecure as well. There are going to be shortcuts that people take in order to make sure that they can at least have a workaround to access a system that they can't otherwise do. And that shortcut might well, and that workaround might well introduce insecurities in its own right.
Just to add that, if we put the 21.4, I think it is, % of Australians who are acknowledged as having a disability, if you think about it from a business perspective as well, that's greater than the population of Melbourne or the greater than the population of Sydney. That's a lot of people that you're potentially excluding as part of your audience, whether you're in business, whether you're in government, whether you're a not-for-profit. That's a large part of Australia that you're saying one of these capital cities is no longer part of our target audience. And think about it from that perspective. You know, as Neil said, yes, security is paramount, but that is a hell of a lot of people that you're saying not relevant to us.
If I can just add from a DDA perspective, and you know, this is when a law like the DDA becomes a tool for advocacy for greater access. So there is, as I mentioned, the legal standard of equal access to goods and services. Now, that's not to say that that can only be provided through one specific program, but that has to be one of the outcomes that a department or an organization is working towards, and they can work, you know, for the writer of the question, you can work with them to kind of explore what that looks like, but it is on the duty holders to look at what are the options available, what are the things that are being weighing up, or the considerations that are being weighed up. And the standard within the DDA is that an adjustment must be provided unless you reach that threshold of unjustifiable hardship, and the guidelines explains what makes up unjustifiable hardship, and that's, you know, to be assessed within each of the circumstances. So I'd say use the DDA and use the guidelines as an advocacy tool to help you in those conversations, and remind duty holders that they've got obligations to seek to achieve equal access.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sophia. Just a note around sign language interpretation. So we know we had a few issues with the setup, which we believe we've resolved. You should still be able to, or at least access sign language interpretation through the interpretation button and select Auslan. We thank you for your patience. We obviously didn't get this quite right at the start and hope that it has been resolved. And thank you for everyone who was sending through messages letting us know things weren't quite working. Excuse me. On to our next question. This one is actually about and a question from an individual. I'm a deaf person and I've found myself in situations where I have to navigate automated calls and instructions before reaching the right person on the other side to resolve an issue. It's always a challenge to listen to the instructions and press the correct numbers, and this process can take several attempts. Call centres that are used by many businesses use chatbots in the absence of an email address to resolve issues. So the questions in relation to this are, do the accessibility guidelines or the guidelines newly published apply to phone calls and automated messages? And can instructions be displayed as live caption text on the screen to assist hearing impaired users? Sophia, I might direct that one at you.
The short answer, I think, would be yes, the guidelines apply, and as does the Disability Discrimination Act. And then in terms of the technical detail, I might throw to my Intopia colleagues if that's okay.
I think probably important to say that this is, I think Sophia is quite right to look at this in the context of what the law requires, which is an equal service. So a service that does not discriminate against the individual trying to consume the service, if you like. So that's the issue. The technical solution is kind of secondary to that, because the most important thing is, what is the service provider going to do to ensure that someone in that consumer's position can access their services? What is their way of doing that? If they can't do it through a technical way, what is their alternative?
And just picking up on the mention of chatbots, Intopia's experience is that, chatbots in systems that we're testing are very often problematic. People tend to just take a chatbot off the shelf and plug it into their system. The rest of their system may be accessible, but the chatbot component often hasn't had that requirement when people are out there sourcing a chatbot to go into their retail or service environment. So, we do find that often. That's not to say that you can't make chatbots accessible. There are some very highly accessible chatbots out there, but it is a perennial problem that we seem to encounter.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Andrew. I'm going to go to one of the Q&A questions that have been submitted. This one actually mentions that the guidelines around universal design for learning weren't included in Chapter 3 in the standards and guidelines feature. But I wanted to broaden this out a bit too, and I might pass to you, Andrew. I know there was a bit of a decision process in sort of what went in, but also the fact that we are referencing versions in that the existing guidelines. Can you talk us through a little bit about how we went about including, different guidelines within Chapter 3?
By and large, we were looking for local standards and guidelines because they are immediately applicable in Australia. So we know that there are lots of international guidelines, but they haven't necessarily been adopted here as standards, either through Standards Australia or through other government policy or industry policy. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are one instance where they've an international guideline that we don't have an Australian version of, but they have been widely adopted since the late 90s, early 2000s through government policy, and through various industry policies. So we've taken them into account. But there are numerous other international guidelines that we decided to exclude just on the basis of we didn't want to write a thesis on guidelines that might or might not be applicable. So we were fairly selective there. That said, if anybody does have a guideline that they feel should have been included, and we've had a couple of emails around this already with things that are international guidance, whether they're an ISO standard or coming from somewhere else, please contact the Commission with a suggestion for an update. And I might pass to you, Sophia, about what the Commission might be considering along those lines.
Yes, thank you. We're definitely open to receiving any advice or considerations. And with a document like this, especially the last two chapters, it's linking out to a number of other resources and standards. And so we will endeavor to keep it up to date and to review it fairly regularly to make sure that we're linking to the most up-to-date resource. But if you become aware that a link is bringing you to the wrong place, please let us know. We'd be really happy to be prompted through that channel.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Actually got a few questions both that have been submitted and also came through registration. I'm going to combine them into one, and it's actually around, first of all, raising awareness of the new guidelines and also digital accessibility more broadly. So there was a comment around people don't necessarily hang out on the Commission website and what have you. How do they know about this? How do we sort of build this awareness, of the new guidelines? Obviously, the Disability Discrimination Act's been around a long time, but we're hoping that these guidelines do drive a renewed interest and change. Maybe starting with you, Sophia, does the Commission have any sort of thoughts around, ways to spread the word essentially about this and increase that awareness?
Yes, definitely. This is the second webinar, and I see there's really great attendance with 188 participants. So this is the first dissemination exercise, and we really encourage everyone in the room here to take the guidelines and run with it, and disseminate them within your circles and with your stakeholders. Digital accessibility, accessibility more broadly, it's within the DDA and also within the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it's always topical because we live in a world like we're online all of the time. Well, I'm online all of the time. Wish I was a little less. I won't speak for others, but we live a very digital life. Like we're always connected. So I know it's something that's spoken a lot fairly often, and there's a lot of discussions as well around AI now, and that's infiltrated, political discussion as well. So we'll keep trying to disseminate the guidelines through various, speaking engagements and representations that we have with our stakeholder groups. But we're also a very small team, so we kind of rely on some of the people in the room as well to spread the word.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Yep, Andrew.
We've already been approached by a few organisations that would like us to come and do what I'll call a lunch and learn, a brief overview to their teams. So that's been pleasing to have seen that, including an approach from the higher education sector to do a much broader session. The other thing that what some of you might do if you're thinking, lots of organisations have internal newsletters, staff newsletters of one sort or another. Maybe you could write a few paragraphs and get it published. Just leave that as a suggestion.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. And yes, Intopia's definitely got plans. As Sophia said, we're sort of going through webinar launch, Q&A, but we are definitely working both with individual organisations to increase the awareness and answer questions around the guidelines, and we'll also sort of be slowly putting out different things that we think might raise that awareness of the guidelines, or actually, you know, help people, you know, internally maybe raise the awareness within their organisations as well. Sophia, I'd say the next one is definitely for you. So might it be theoretically possible to convert these guidelines into a standard under the Disability Discrimination Act? So similar to the, say, the current transport and promised aviation standards. Would that be, is that something that is a possibility in the future?
It is a possibility. It is doable. So definitely within the realm of what can be done. Obviously, that is a decision for government to make, and so relies on fairly intense systemic advocacy and civil society, as well as the Commission, making the case for the standards to be translated into, I guess, a legal standard under the DDA, or the guidelines, sorry, to be translated into a standard under the DDA. What we know, and I mean, it's only a few days after the election, we know there's a return Labour government that's coming into power. In its first term, the government committed to a review of the Disability Discrimination Act. So we're hoping that a return government means that that will occur within the next few months, and there will be public consultation on what should be, what amendments should be made to the Disability Discrimination Act. So I would encourage everyone here to engage and submit to that consultation once it opens, and to make the case for a standard. Without getting into the detail, and I'm glad to go into it, if it's of interest to everyone in the room, please put some questions in the chat, and we can talk about it in more detail. I think translating the guidelines into a standard under the DDA would be one piece of the puzzle, and you'd want some other amendments, such as a positive duty, greater enforcement powers granted to the Commission, that altogether would provide a more robust legal framework, and some stronger obligations on duty holders to comply with the standards if they were to exist. I hope that wasn't too nebulous or talking in codes, but can go into it into more detail if that's of interest.
No, I think that's great and fantastic, and I love the way you've sort of highlighted that there are multiple pieces to this. You know, that, you know, if we, I guess, we're looking for a holy grail of, you know, what this would look like and all work together, that, you know, maybe moving the guidelines into a standard would be one piece, but there are other pieces that probably also need to fall into place in order for, you know, it to be a bit of a stronger, let's say, legislation.
Exactly. And there's the opening now, like it's not often that we get the opportunity for law reform. You know, it's maybe once every few decades that it's actually on the cards. And we think there's really a strong chance, because it was announced pre-election and the conditions with a return government. Like I'd say the time is right to be making those kinds of recommendations to the government to consider.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sophia. So let's get a little bit more into a particular space around customer versus employee experience. So we had a question that said that, you know, traditionally we've seen organisations focus more on the customer-facing, say, digital products and services, and I would say that's definitely in line with what Intopia has seen as well. But the comment was that as HCM and finance systems are moving into SaaS, so software as a service-based products, are we seeing a trend of accessibility improvements that actually impact employee systems for businesses? Might throw to either Neil or Andrew.
I'll jump in first there.
Yep.
Yeah. First of all, I think, you know, from an employee perspective, COVID and working from home highlighted the issue to many, many organisations prior to that, you were able to go down the corridor and ask somebody in IT, ask your neighbour, how does this work? Working from home, you're isolated, you don't have that instant answer. And so I think a lot of IT branches, departments in organisations found that, oh, we have to do something a bit more than we've done in the past. Coming back to the SaaS, software as a service aspect of that, the advantage of moving from an installed bit of software inside your organisation to software as a service is that I think it's much easier for organisations who are providing that type of software to say we can do very easy incremental updates rather than relying on having a big update annually or something like that, and then you've got the delay of the organisation saying, yes, does it meet our requirements, is it still secure, and all the rest of it, and rolling it out. The advantage of SaaS is that that incremental update can happen on a much more regular basis. And we're finding some of the organisations we're working with, and Sarah, you might like to comment on this, are actually doing lots of little incremental updates as we're finding things and making recommendations to them.
I think probably also worth saying that yes, I think it makes the opportunity for that trend to exist. The question was asking about the trends, for example, and I think the opportunity that Andrew has drawn attention to is exactly true. I think it really does give an opportunity for systems to be more accessible because of the way that they are deployed. They still have to be accessible though. So it's like anything else, HTML or any other software or web code or whatever it happens to be. If that is not accessible, then the output won't be accessible. So really important to stress that, yes, the opportunity is there, and I think we will see it, and I think we are seeing it. But we're also seeing examples where it's still pretty awful, and if you put awful in, you'll get awful out.
And Neil, I might point out, you've got direct experience of that as well, don't you?
Oh, yeah. I'm
thinking just an expert here, but as a person day to day who probably has to deal with this.
Yeah, and I will give an example if you like, but I won't name names, much as I would love to. But the names don't really matter because it was outside Australia. But I won't name them anyway. But it was a government department in another country, which during COVID had a requirement that people coming back into the country once we were able to travel again had to fill out a declaration and a form that said that you weren't ill and you'd been tested and you could prove that you'd been tested and all those sorts of things. You'll all remember those if you did travel at the time. Every government did it. This particular government did it in such a way that even though it had guidelines and standards that it was supposed to adhere to, specifically passed by that very government, the form was unusable and inaccessible for anybody using a screen reader, to the point that you literally, there's nothing that you could do. It was beyond workarounds. And that is not entirely unusual. But this happened in a place that should have known better, and it happened in an environment that was mission critical, because if you couldn't fill that form out, you weren't getting on the plane to come home. And that was very much an example. There are many, many more.
Thank you, Neil. And Sophia.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to come back to the customer versus employee question, and just to remind people that the DDA covers employment as an area of public life as much as it does access to goods and services. So employers under the Disability Discrimination Act have an obligation towards their employee to non-discriminate. So both settings are covered and given equal weight, I guess, under the law.
Fantastic. And I think what we've actually seen, so just picking up on that side of sort of SaaS products and also the experience Intopia has had. First of all, federal government is required to meet EN 301549 when procuring any digital product or service. So that's definitely meant that organisations who are providing software into federal government have had to tighten up on their accessibility, and that's certainly been in place for a number of years. Second of all, we've definitely seen more large corporates also including it in their procurement, and the work, for instance, that Andrew and Neil did with ATSET, which was in the university for the university sector, the tertiary sector, advising on that, has contributed to that as well. But the third, and this is outside of Australia, the European Accessibility Act is coming into force on the 30th of June. And that has really put, again, an international focus on companies that are selling sort of software as a service like this, and often that is into the employee space. So we know we're working with organisations who are needing to look at those obligations under the European Accessibility Act, and that will again have flow-on impacts for Australians as well, because as Andrew mentioned, when these companies start to roll out these updates, they do get rolled out to every single organisation and individual that are using these. So I think there's a lot of different levers that are being sort of pulled to improve that in employee experience, but we can definitely do more.
Just on that, we may be a small player internationally in terms of our purchase power, but every squeak that an organisation gets adds up to a very noisy environment for them to pay some attention to. And building on the fact that, as Sarah just mentioned, there's a big international push across Europe now in particular, and some extent in the US. If we can add our voices to that from the organisation you work for, with some feedback to the organisation, the company you've purchased your internal or external software platforms from, it just adds to the noise that they have to start paying attention to.
Fantastic, thank you. So a general question was actually, do you have any examples of, and I might substitute organisations with, organisations that are maybe successfully implementing the guidelines. So don't necessarily have to call out individual organisations, but what are some of the great things that you've seen in organisations that, would be maybe ahead of the curve in terms of the guidelines? Neil, Andrew, I think that would be your area, just to poke you.
Never know who to go first.
Neil, off you go.
So I think probably the first thing to say is that the guidelines are a collection of good practices, and so really important that people don't get the idea that the aim is to implement the guidelines per se. I mean, yes, that's what we ultimately want, but as you say there in the question, I think that there is lots and lots of things that people can do to make progress down that road of implementing the various guidelines throughout this document, and I think that's really important. So, yeah, we work a lot with organisations. Andrew and I do work with organisations, particularly around their what we would call maturity, and how well are they making accessibility business as usual, because that's ultimately what it's about. It's about making the very act of creating an accessible product something that they don't do as an add-on, they don't do at the end when it's going to be more expensive and therefore harder to do. They do it as part of the entire development process, and going right back to the very beginning when they're even, I hate the word, but I'll use it, ideating. That's the one time you'll ever hear me say that, so make the most. So I think that's we do see great examples of designers who are empowered and upskilled to ensure that they can provide accessible solutions that then go forward to the developers and so on and so forth. So that's good. But I think also a general understanding that things like universal access benefits everybody. It's not just something which is for this bunch of people in the corner. Admittedly, it's a large bunch of people in the corner. Andrew mentioned the population bigger than Melbourne and Australia. That's a big corner, right? But it's actually something. There is no development that benefited disabled people that ever caused a problem for non-disabled people, and everyone benefits from good access. So, including the people that provide it, by the way, it's not just a thing that is benefited by the customer or by the employee. Also, the service provider benefits from good access, from higher sales and better public reputation and that sort of thing. So yeah, if you go through all the different things that are covered in the guidelines, we see lots of good examples, but often they are isolated. One organization will do particularly well in one area, but not so well in another. And the aim is to make that aggregate improvement greater.
And just two examples of where that curb cut effect comes into digital. There's lots and lots of evidence now that many more people than people who are deaf or hard of hearing turn captions on when they've got watching something on a screen. And the other one, is dark mode. The number of people who are using dark mode is far beyond people with low vision.
Fantastic, thank you. So a bit of a practical question. How do organisations go about prioritising accessibility improvements when resources are limited? So the example is, is it better to focus on critical services first, or maybe take a whole of website approach from the start? I might start with you, Andrew, and then I will pass over to Sophia from the Commission's perspective.
That's a really good question, and that prioritisation question comes up fairly regularly in the discussions that we all have within Intopia and possibly within the Commission. But yes, looking at your critical services, what are the services that are the most important that you're putting out there? That's certainly a very good place to start. But while you're doing that and you're looking at the different aspects of that and how does somebody get there, what's their journey to get to that critical service, you need to not just look at the service in isolation, but you need to look at that service in the context of the whole user experience and pick up those different pathways, because some people will come in through search, some people might land directly on it, some people might follow a link that's from another organisation, say if you're a government agency. So think about all those different pathways, not just the isolated service in the centre there that people that you're deciding is critical, because there's critical information around that and critical things further outside that may be important. So that that's a very good thing to think about. The other aspect is from a criticality point of view, what is the most important service, but what's the most popular service? That mightn't be your most critical, but it might be the one that your the people who are coming to your organisation digitally are looking at the most frequently. So Neil mentioned the one of travel. It probably wasn't the most necessarily the most highly used service by that government agency, except at that point in time, but it was a very critical one from their perspective. So weighing up the different aspects of how to prioritise. Start with the things that are popular, or from your delivery perspective, most critical. That's probably a good place to start.
Yeah, think about the impact that the service has on people, and whether that impact is impact of it not being accessible as well, whether that would be high risk, low risk, as well as high quantity, low quantity.
The other aspect there is, don't wait till it's perfect. Incremental improvements are going to benefit somebody along the way. So don't just put it, say, oh, it's going to take us 12 months to make this perfectly accessible. Put the updates out there on a regular basis, because every little update will help somebody, every little accessibility improvement will help somebody better access that service.
Sophia, did you have anything to add?
I guess what I would add, I mean, those were all really good suggestions. And I like, Neil, what you said about, also assessing the risk of not being accessible and the cost and the impact of that. Like, often think about, what happens if you don't do something, and assessing that as much as if you're going to do it. And from the DDA perspective, accessibility is related to measures that can be taken that will meet the needs of a group, like ideally of all, and if not of most people. There's also provisions within the Disability Discrimination Act to look at reasonable adjustments. So adjustments that respond to a person or a smaller group's individual needs. And so, in that prioritization exercise, where something can't necessarily be made accessible to all, making clear that there are other adjustments that can be made, and that there's another pathway that people can interact with the service, where they can request adjustments so that they can utilize that service on equal footing with others.
Fantastic. And we're approaching our last question because we've only got a few minutes. What do you see as future trends, or even things not covered in the guidelines, which was another question that came through? Future trends or things that are not covered in the guidelines that you would have liked to cover. What do you think those are things are that people should be watching out for, or staying on top of?
We did pick up
Andrew?
a few trends that some of that came out of the Human Rights and Technology report, but some of the things are the things that have been happening really recently, like the predominance of AI in just about everything. And I was bemoaning earlier, wondering why my system has been slowing down over the last few months, and noted that every program I open just about these days offers the AI assistant inside it, and I figure that is using up a lot of processing power with everything that I run. So I think AI is a big one, and is things, there's a lot of people out there saying AI is going to solve the accessibility problem. We know that's far from the truth. AI may assist, but it's not going to solve your accessibility issues. And Neil, you might like to elaborate on that one in particular.
I totally agree. I think AI is one of those generational, groundbreaking events, really, when it comes to accessibility, to access to information. We got it in the 90s with access to the World Wide Web, and I genuinely believe that AI is in that category. However, it is not the solution, as Andrew says. It's a tool to be used for a wider solution, and there are as many risks with the AI to people who with disability as there are advantages and benefits, and the sensible approach is to get that balance right and to manage it properly. The other thing that Andrew we talked about, I think, in the guidelines very briefly, we would have liked to have gone into it into more detail, but that space didn't really permit, was the whole issue of biometrics, and how that is going to be. It's already quite big nowadays. You can't unlock your iPhone without looking at it, and or using your fingerprint or whatever. That's, I think, just the very beginning. In the future, there'll be a lot more things that you will have to use facial ID or fingerprints or other biometrics to access. And I think that has quite major, far-reaching implications for people with disability.
Thank you very much. Well, we're right on the hour, so I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and in particular to Sophia, Neil, and Andrew for sharing their wisdom and their experience with the guidelines. Thank you to AI Media and also Deaf Connect for providing the captions and sign language interpretation. As noted, we will have a recording of this session available on Intopia's YouTube channel. And as well, we will follow up with any questions that we didn't get to. I do know there are some we didn't get to, and like with the webinar, launch webinar, we'll provide some written answers. Thank you all very much. Have a fantastic day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.